I think first we should talk a little bit about how you Copts would identify yourself. What are the main characteristics of the Coptic Church and the Coptic people?
Thank you very much for that question. So to start off, there is some interesting etymological aspects that I think we can begin with. The word Copt itself, it derives from the Greek term Aegyptos, but that term is supposedly derived from the Egyptian words ha-kapta, meaning the house of the glory of Ptah, Ptah being the old Egyptian pagan god. So the word itself has had a lot of change over time in terms of what it refers to, in terms of its connotations. And I think that change is continuing even today, especially after 2015, when the murder by ISIS of the 21 martyrs, as we call them in Arabic, the Shuhada at Libya, occurred. Coptic itself has many meanings in the modern English sense. It can refer to the Coptic people, who are the direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian people who, as I mentioned previously, would have worshipped Ptah, among many other gods. Coptic Christianity, though, really is just an adjectival sense. It's not a specific religion in and of itself. It's really Christianity as practiced by the Copts, or as practiced by the Coptic people, the original people of Egypt, who, after the coming of the Holy Family through Egypt and later Saint Marcos, established Christianity in Egypt, as was prophesied in the Bible. And from there, grew it into a church that has now spread all across the world, including in the United States and Australia, parts of Africa, and the Middle East, as well as Europe now, as you know, from me sitting here today.
Absolutely. And what do you think, what makes the Coptic people different from other Christians? So what are the unique Christian characters of the Coptic Church?
That's a very good question. Before I answer it, I'd like to step back a little bit and see the context in which Copts themselves, or Coptic Christianity, is really placed. So Coptic Christianity is one of the Oriental Orthodox churches. And the Oriental Orthodox churches are, in terms of the ecclesiastical history, those churches that split off from mainstream Christianity, you could say, or mainline Chalcedonian, Chalcedonian Christianity in, if I'm not mistaken, around 540, somewhere around that time,
around
after the Council of Chalcedon. And what that dispute was it was a dispute about about Christology, essentially, about the nature of Christ, how he should be understood. And according to the definition that was ultimately adopted at that council, which is the Diophysite or the Ophysitos definition, Christ is one person within which are two natures, which are together but not confused. And the reason for the split was that the Miaphysite churches, which include the Coptic Church, but also the Armenian, now the Ethiopian, now the Eritrean, as well as the Syriac and St. Thomas Christians, as well as many others formerly, adopted a slightly different, but ultimately really semantically kind of the same definition. And so it's funny because now there are actually talks and real considerations to unify the churches under the understanding that perhaps some of this may have been a little bit of linguistic shenanigans, more political rather than real religious or theological in essence. Today, the Coptic Church, as I said, are within the Oriental Orthodox churches. And what defines the Coptic Church, I think, as unique, first of all, the music, the hymns. There are some hymns in the Coptic Church that you'll hear if you ever visit our church here in Budapest, and I hope you do, which are actually adaptations of old pharaonic hymns. So these would have been used to glorify the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And now, continuing in the Coptic language, they're used to glorify the King of Kings, the living God, Christ, our Savior. So this, I think, is a little bit of uniqueness that Copts in general are very, very proud of. In general, though, the Coptic Church, according to Archpriest Abune Yusuf Khalil, who's the head of our church here in Hungary, rests upon three pillars. And these are monasticism, as first brought into the world really in its current form by Saint Antonius the Great of Egypt, one of the Desert Fathers. Then the School of Alexandria, which was the school established by Saint Marcos, when he came to Egypt to preach Christianity. He found himself so surrounded by such an educated elite community speaking Greek, Egyptian, Latin, everything, that he had to convince some very intelligent people that they could turn their gifts, their logos, their inner wisdom, towards the knowledge of God and towards Christ. And so to do that, he established this school, which has a wonderful history that perhaps we can talk about, but it still survives in some form today. And the final pillar would be the blood of the martyrs, which is the pillar that most people in the West today are aware of, and it's the one that they're most interested in. And we can get into that as well.
All right, I think first we shall step back again a little bit. You were talking about the unification of Christianity, what is nowadays a really interesting topic, and it sounds like an urgent issue. But what do you think, what are the most urgent issues nowadays with Christianity? So what are the most urgent issues we should talk about, we should care about? What problems shall we solve in the next few years? What is your opinion on that?
Well, that is, although it's probably the most important question to ask, it's also one of the most challenging and one of the most complicated, really, I would say. First of all, I'd like to begin there with the issue of internal Christian decay. And there are two different types, I suppose, of this. One type might be when people fall away from the church. They stop going to church. They stop believing that church has value. They stop going for confession. Initially because, maybe they're reluctant, they don't want to admit that maybe they have some sins that actually they themselves would benefit from cleansing spiritually and psychologically as well. And then I think from that, we get the second type of decay, which I'm going to call for what it is simply heresy. And heresy comes from the Greek word hairesis, which means to appropriate, to take something for yourself. To take something that is not yours and make it your own. We have today in the world, and I've seen a lot of this, quite frankly, in the United States, many reinterpretations of parts of Christianity which deviate from the form in which they have been understood for 2,000 years and prior to that by the Israelites or the Jews of the Old Testament. I see this as a really urgent issue because when you tell people that, for instance, you're perfect exactly as you are because God loves you. Well, no. God's love for you is a warm hug. It's arms being reached out towards you, but you must accept the hug. You must lean forward. You must embrace him. You must love him, as it says in the Old Testament. Min kulli qulubikum wa nafusikum wa quwwatikum, with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your might. And I think today we have a lot of churches, especially in the United States and in North America and some other places, where people have forgotten this. And this relates to other cultural issues. I'm perfect just the way I am. Nobody can tell me what to do. And this leads us away from God, and it leads to terrible loss and destruction, some of which can be, in the case of individuals, certainly, it can be irreversible. You can have people who fall so far away because of false teachings that they simply lose hope, and it becomes hard to ever see a way for them to come back, even though God is there waiting for them. So I think that these two forms of decay really, which are to a certain extent everywhere in the world right now, even in Egypt, you could say, very urgent problems that have to be addressed.
And what do you think for the entirety of the church? What can be the solution for this problem? So, of course, these are personal decisions. Who leaves the church? Who stays in the church? But can we find some sort of solution that can help to the churches bringing back the sinning people?
Well, as Christians, we're called upon to lead by example. The truth is, and we see this in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, there are many cases where the examples that show us how to live, that show us what is true and what is not, are not only positive examples, but also dangerous examples. We see in the Old Testament, in the stories of the fall of Jericho, of the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see so many times, over and over again, cases where people have fallen away from God, and we see the destruction that awaits that, because God, at the end of the day, is good. And so falling away from God means falling towards evil. And when we fall towards evil, we will find ourselves in very evil circumstances indeed. And so for that reason, I see this as an urgent need, that we can recognize that by looking at some of the bad examples, we can be reminded, okay, well, this is probably something I should avoid. This is probably something I can stray away from. And in the world right now, there is no shortage of bad examples.
For sure. As we are talking about examples, could you tell us some sort of personal story, one or two, about how you find Christ and what were your experiences with Christianity in Egypt or in other parts of the world? As I understood previously, you are making studies about martyrs and the issue of Christian persecution. Could you please share us some sort of details about these incidents?
So my story of coming to Christ is a long one, but in terms of the issues of Christian persecution, and you're correct in saying that one of the areas of study that I'm very much devoted to is martyrology. We have the aforementioned case of the 21 martyrs of Libya, which, if you don't mind, I think maybe now is a good time to talk about. The 21 martyrs are probably the most important, certainly the most visual example of Christian persecution within the Coptic Church that has existed in modern times. And as we see, we just talked about examples. I think in that horrific video, which I've seen far too many times to even remember, we have the paramount cases of an example of dedication, of truth, of love, of righteousness, of standing up with head unbowed, even against the heaviest of chains around one's neck. And on the other side, we have an example of ruthlessness. We have an example of intolerance. We have an example of hatred. We have an example, like in John 1, the light shines upon the darkness and the darkness does not comprehend it. And I think that this incident did so much to spread awareness around Christian persecution in the Middle East, the persecution of Copts in particular. But I will say that whenever we talk about Christian persecution, there are two sides, at least from the perspective that I know, which is my church. The one side is the sheer horror, the inhumanity, of this type of persecution, the hatred, the negative emotions, the feelings of loss, suffering, pain. But this second part, and this is something I really think is often lost in translation, so to speak. I think it's something that was missing in all of those newspaper articles that we saw come out about, oh my goodness, this has happened, and it did happen, and we should know that, we should remember that, we should remember their names. But there is another side, which is gratitude, which is awe, which is respect, which is, and this will sound strangest of all, happiness, glorification. And there are interviews which can be found online with the mothers and the wives and the sisters of the martyrs. And I would encourage any of your listeners who might be listening to this right now to go search for those, because when you look at those, you will see the full spectrum of human emotion. You'll see tears, you'll see wailing, you'll see loss, but you will also see deep down, sometimes hidden behind a mask of sadness, you will see the love and happiness that one of our own, one of our brothers, our husbands, our fathers, our sons, has gone to the Lord and is now in his embrace. And that is a very important thing that I would like everyone to understand, that we are not a church of victims, but we are a church of martyrs.
It's a very brave message for all the European and American Christians. Of course, you were studying this particular case and others as well in Egypt and in the Middle East. Could you say a few numbers or details in which countries are the most problematic in case of Christian persecution? Could you share some details about it? Nowadays, it's pretty hard to find fresh news about how these Christians live, what are their circumstances. So could you please brighten this topic a little bit for us?
Of course. So quantitative data on the subject is very hard to find because, of course, before we talk about quantities, we have to talk about the qualities, which is what exactly we are measuring in the first place. Christian persecution could be on a data point of this guy was killed because he was Christian, a very obvious case. But what about a case where you have a Christian family and a Muslim family living next to each other, and because of the deep-seated prejudices that can exist in these contexts, you have perhaps a family dispute, a few words exchanged that ultimately leads up to physical violence and then perhaps death. Is that Christian persecution? Well, perhaps it is, but the data aren't there. There is no way of tracking these things. And I tell you that in Egypt, most certainly, because all over the country you have Christians and Muslims living together. For the most part, I would say in harmony, relative harmony, although there are issues that exist. The type of persecution that you will find is unlikely to be visible. To get that, you really have to hear the human stories. You have to talk to people about what they've experienced. I can tell you, for example, that one time while walking down the street in Cairo, I was spat on by a gentleman who noticed my Coptic tattoo, which virtually all of us have. So I would call that a case of Christian persecution, but I'm not aware of any surveys that would be collecting that type of data. Certainly in Egypt, it's somewhat difficult to do that. Stepping back to the broader context of the Middle East, there are, and I'm not sure how many of them are in the Middle East actually, but I believe there are between 10 and 11 countries that will execute Christians who have converted from Islam. This being, the term for this in the Islamic context is irtidad, or apostasy. And the person who commits irtidad, according to the Sharia, is a murtad, or an apostate. And so it's a strange case to talk about, because if someone is killed for coming to Christ, most academics actually do not consider that to be Christian persecution. They would say, oh, well, this is a Muslim apostate who was killed. And I don't see why secular Western academics tend to adopt the Islamic law frame for this. It's very strange to me. There are other countries where similar prohibitions exist. I believe it's in Morocco that until very recently, or perhaps still now, it was illegal to own copies of the Bible in Arabic, making it quite literally impossible to practice Christianity in any tangible form. There are many countries where building new churches is either officially, legally prohibited. Saudi Arabia, I believe, is one of those cases, which is somewhat obvious, but there are others. But there are many more countries where to a certain extent in Egypt as well, where building new churches or even restoring churches is not technically impossible, but practically very much impossible. We're talking about going through webs of permits that have a 100% denial rate. You know,
so
100%.
The authorities make it impossible.
It can be the authorities. It can be, some guy in the administration who just is not a fan of Christianity and doesn't want to see this happening in what he believes to be, his Muslim country. There are many ways that it can happen, but it happens.
You already told an exact story of yours. Could you share some more how you personally live with this situation in Egypt? How you as a Christian are treated in Egypt?
Of course. So I should preface this with the fact that I haven't lived in Egypt. I've been there twice. Once the second time for my baptism, actually, because I'm not sure if this is clear to your listeners by now, but I actually converted to Coptic Christianity about 10 years ago, being born into a kind of secular Jewish kind of atheistic background in New York City. So I have my own sort of weird way of coming into this.
We are all coming on strange ways to Christ.
I would very much agree with that statement. So in that sense, I prefer, when I talk about this to others, not to share my own limited first-hand experience, which is there, but to share more the conversations that I've had with other Christians who live in Egypt, some still living there now, including some converts from Islam who I have personally met.
Then could you please share us some of these conversations? These sound really interesting.
Of course. Some of the cases, I mean, one of the most difficult to talk about, but unfortunately not terribly uncommon examples that I've heard of real cases of are of effective religious kidnappings of Coptic Christian girls. The Islamic marriage ceremony is very quick. It can be conducted very quickly. And in order to divorce, the husband, according to Islamic law, has to say these words, talaq, 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 which means divorce, divorce, divorce. And once he says that, the marriage is dissolved.
But 3 times.
Yes. 2 times is like a threat, which imagine living with that over your head. But there have been cases, and recently the good news is these are starting to attract more attention in the global media, which I think is very positive, where Christian girls are sort of taken by colleagues, sometimes friends or colleagues, sometimes neighbors, sometimes random strangers, married off, and then they are legally under the custodial authority of the husband. So they're now in a situation that it is potentially impossible for them to get out of. They now have to go, if they want to try and get the marriage, annulled through external means, they have to go to an Islamic court, but they are not Muslims. So, I mean, can you imagine the sort of difficulties that can ensue in these types of situations? Now, again, this is not an everyday thing, but neither is it incredibly uncommon. Everyone in Egypt has heard of at least one story such as this from their town or some village nearby where they live. So this is one thing that really is very deeply concerning for Christians in Egypt. And it's one of the reasons actually why Christian Egyptians also have, for better or worse, become sort of a bit more protective over women in a way that can be seen as leading to compromises in women's rights. Because, an Egyptian Christian father might be kind of unhappy with sending his daughter to a university there or something like this, but he'll be totally fine sending her to a university abroad. And so here in Hungary, we have many Christian foreign students from Egypt who are sent here for a better education, but also for the safety and peace of mind, really, that provides. A lot of Egyptian Christian women and girls also wear the hijab, even though they don't need to at all. kind of to avoid attracting male attention and for these reasons as well. So there are a lot of aspects to the female side of the sort of everyday persecution and oppression that I think are worth considering. Sorry, go ahead.
As you already mentioned, Hungary, probably you know it better than me that Hungary has so-called Christian helping programs. How effective would you say this or other Western helping programs are in the concrete situations on the Middle East? Can these programs be effective? Or how could these be a little bit more helpful?
Well, to start off, I'll make a remark about Hungary and its sort of international influence and its geopolitical approaches to these things. I mean, the Hungarian government has been calling for peace in a different context in the Russo-Ukrainian war for a long time, and I think the only other country in Europe that has been doing that, or at least so vocally, is the Vatican. So, I mean, that's kind of a testament to sort of how Hungary at least tries, and how the Hungarian government tries to approach and mediate in situations. Speaking of mediation, relations between Christians and Muslims in the Middle East are indeed very, very difficult to mediate. I would say on the ground level, the country where you have the most trust between Christians and Muslims is quite possibly Syria, because Syria is a place where Christian bishops and priests, etc., are very much on the side of secular Muslims and the Alawites there and other types who have opposed ISIS. At the same time, they have been calling for the end of sanctions, which are illegally destroying the welfare of the Syrian people. Syria is one of the countries in which Hungary helps operates. And as I understand it, the way that they approach problems is to build solutions that are not just temporary, but stable in the long term. Let me explain very briefly what the difference between that is. When the United States threw money at the Palestinians and the Israelis to get the Camp David Accords done, the Oslo Accords, all of this, everyone cheered and celebrated. And then, after a couple decades and some of the money's not there anymore, we see that the conflicts are still there right back now. And there's been actually quite a lot of violence in that context between the Israelis and the Palestinians this year.
For sure.
Then, so I think that what Hungary is doing can be contrasted to that approach of just throw money at the problem and everything will get better. Returning to Syria, what Hungary helps, as I understand, is doing is building, for instance, schools in areas where you have substantial Christian populations. Because remember, we're talking about a very small minority here, and a minority which, unfortunately, has been terribly adversely affected by mass emigration, mass exit, has a lot of old people left behind who, now there's no young people to take care of them anymore. Excuse me. In that context, they're building schools in sort of areas where there still are Christians. And in these schools, Muslims are welcome. So what you have is Christians and Muslims sitting side by side together, studying and learning, hey, these guys aren't actually so bad. And that's how you build a stable foundation for the future. It's about creating friendships, building up social ties that, quite frankly, have not really been there for God knows how long, okay? In Egypt, I think that's a place where Hungary helps might already be active, but I'm not actually aware of their work in that regard.
And as we were talking about it before, mostly these countries where Christians are persecuted nowadays, and in the Middle East also, most of the countries are Muslim, or these are Islamic states. What do you think is the effect of the Islam itself on Christianity in these countries, and how do they view Christians? Of course, there are differences between Syria and Egypt, but what are your experiences?
So, Islam is a religion that it has four foundations, you could say, or in Arabic, usul. And these are the Quran, which is to Muslims, this is the literal word of God as revealed to Muhammad, the Prophet. The hadith, or the ahadith in the plural, which is the sayings of Muhammad that were collected over time through a direct recitation of witnesses going back to him. The third one is ijma', which is the consensus of the scholars. And the fourth one is qiyas, which is like the reasoning, the kind of basically applying all the others to sort of work out how to solve a specific problem at a time, right? And already we have four things which are very different. They're different in format. And we also have very different types of Islam. You know, we have Shia Islam, which actually used to be the predominant form in Egypt. A lot of people don't know this today, but some of the worst Christian persecution historically was not actually by the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority in Egypt today, but by the Shia Muslim caliphs of the Fatimid Caliphate. The most infamous of these was a gentleman called Al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, which is the ruler by the will of God, I think. And he was the one who destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, forced Christians and Jews to wear like specific hats and like colors. And
some special clothes.
Yes, exactly. It sounds kind of familiar to something, doesn't it? Yes. And that actually was a factor in the Crusades later on. So, I mean, Western and Eastern Christian history is very much related in this sense. You know, the destruction of the actual Church of the Holy Sepulchre by they call him the Mad Caliph, even in Arabic, he's called that, is very much related to subsequent geopolitical events and stuff like this. But to talk about the effect of Islam in a general sense, I think would require a series of lectures rather than the interview we're doing now. But already I hope that I've been able to give an answer to your listeners, and that you can see the differences between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam in some of these ways over history. And I would say that on the human level, it's very variable. You know, you do have Muslims who are very, very good friends of Christians, even to Muslims who convert to Christianity. And I've seen this with my own eyes, and I know such people. So I am not of the view that, you know, any Muslim or every Muslim inherently hates Christians. But when we talk about Islam rather than Muslims, then there, I believe we can have a conversation, just a very long one.
I would like to ask you about a little bit different question. We were already talking about the migration out of Syria for the Christians. But I already heard about it that from Egypt, the Coptic Church, for example, went for a long way because there were a lot of immigrants. What are the circumstances of these immigrants? Are their new countries welcoming, or have you some sort of stories or experiences in this topic?
Absolutely. I mean, I've spent time at Coptic churches in many countries. The St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Church in London was where I first was. Then, obviously, our church here in Hungary, which is St. Michael and Archangel Michael and St. Mary Church. And then at Coptic churches in Canada, in Toronto, and in California. Very interesting stories from there. I think that essentially overall, for a multitude of reasons, Coptic Christians are very welcoming, but not so aggressively inclined to proselytization. And by that, I mean, you know, come to our church, come to our homes, enjoy a lovely meal, let's have a chat, drink some tea, eat some delicious molokhia. That's this beautiful Egyptian soup you've just got to try sometime. It's lovely. But we're not really visible out on the streets telling people to repent or any such thing. Now, why is that? Well, I think it's kind of obvious that a lot of this is a retained cultural tendency that comes from living as a minority in a Muslim country. But we're minorities everywhere. And, so whatever the cause may be, I think those are some of the things you'll see when you search for Coptic churches in other countries. Now, how do those countries treat them? In America, I've heard of cases where, for example, I was doing some stuff with Sunday schools in our church in California. I heard some people say that they had received some very kind of aggressive and weird questions from more progressive liberal people in public schools that kind of put them on the spot. I'm talking about children here, and I'm talking about children being quizzed by their teachers, which is a bit of, I think, an odd thing for a teacher to do to a child, to quiz them about their religion and ask them to justify themselves on the spot. I wouldn't really do that. As someone
Sounds a little bit problematic.
Very slightly, yeah, which is a word that they love to use, isn't it? But yes, indeed. I would say the countries overall are quite welcoming. But of course, as some parts of the West, and I say some parts because Hungary, which is most certainly a Western country, does not appear, at least I would say for now, to be moving in this direction. Some parts of the West that are kind of determined to, maybe it's almost like they see themselves as, butterflies. They want to shed off the old West, the old Christianity, and become a beautiful, liberal, rainbow-colored creature that will fly around and do everything by itself. But in these countries where that ideology seems to be more dominant, I think that there are some points of perhaps even incompatibility, if I can use that word. And I generally avoid using it. So, yes.
All right. As we go ahead, I would like to ask you a little bit about Hungary itself. So,
of course.
As we already heard from you, the Coptic Church has in Hungary also churches. There is a minority also in Hungary. Could you please talk about a little bit of your local community?
I would absolutely love to. So you've asked this question at the perfect time because last month something very special happened. So the Coptic Pope, Pope Tawadros II, Tawadros Thani, came to visit us at our church, and before doing so, he went on a lovely tour of Hungary, and videos can be found online, met with your Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, as well as many other political figures. And I believe it was on the day that he arrived that the fireworks for St. Stephen's Day were done. So he got to sit in his hotel and watch the beautiful rotating cross made of drones that you did over the Danube, which was really fantastic. This is the second papal visit we've had in 12 years. That is unheard of. Okay,
wow.
I'll tell you what I mean by that. For most churches, there are many Coptic churches in many places around the world. But typically, for one church to get a papal visit, it might happen once in 100 years or less, in most cases. I don't know what the average is. Our church started in, I believe it was back in 1997, when some Copts who were living here, who came here because Hungary was a safe country, a Christian country, and a country with good, hardworking people who were trying to reclaim their historic identity, their cultural identity, their Christian identity after the fall of communism. And I think that was very attractive to the initial immigrants who came and learned Hungarian and are lovely, lovely people, and you'd love to meet them. Later on, the church was built, and it was consecrated in, I believe, 2011 by the previous Pope, Shenouda III. Shenouda III was a pope who had a dear, close connection to Hungary through a friend of his called Makovec Imre, or Imre Makovec. Makovec Imre and the pope wrote letters to each other, and I believe they met in person. And Makovec Imre was asked by Pope Shenouda III to commission a design for the rebuilding of a church in Egypt at a site called Taposiris Magna. And I'll just tell this story if you don't mind. So
we have time for that.
Oh, wonderful! I'm delighted. So Makovec Imre he went to the site with a Hungarian archaeologist friend of his who's Vörös something. I can't recall his name. And examined the site and did the drawings and actually produced the design for the new church, which can be seen. You can actually see this online and in books about it. Pope Shenouda III approved of the design. However, the day before construction was due to start, the Egyptian government under the previous president, Hosni Mubarak, bulldozed the entire site. Bulldozed it, left not a single stone standing, and the church was not rebuilt. And this was a real tragedy that I think broke the hearts of both Pope Shenouda III and Makovec Imre. And Pope Shenouda III came to Hungary in 2011, and he consecrated our church here in Hungary. It was the last church he ever consecrated in his life. He died either 1 or 2 years later, and Makovec Imre also died 1 year apart from him. So this is, in many ways, it's tragedy, but also I think it's a beautiful story and a beautiful friendship. And I think it's a sign of the real connections between the Hungarian, the Christian soul of Hungary, which is also cultural and deeply tied up in the Hungarian historical memory of all the things, good and bad, that have happened since the arrival of the Hungarians here, with the Egyptians, who have their own traumas and their own glories. And I think that this is why Pope Tawadros II decided to come here after just 12 years, picking up where Pope Shenouda III left off.
As we are arriving to the end of the interview, I would like to ask you, what do you predict for the Egyptian Coptic Church for the next few years, decades? Can things have a turn for the better or the worse?
Well, the thing about the Middle East in general, and Egypt is obviously, it's right in the middle of the world, really. As Israel, Egypt, you can't get closer. Things can change very fast. Geographically being the confluence of 3 continents, but also culturally, and I think perhaps this is an area where we can talk about the religious aspect with Islam as well. It's difficult to predict the future except in one domain, and that is demography. And I'm saying this just coming from actually the Budapest Demographic Summit, which I'm attending. Demography is very important. And the fact of the matter is that the Christian exodus that began, I would say, really after the Iraq War, perhaps even the first Gulf War, is a serious threat to the continued existence of not just the Copts, but also Christian communities in the Middle East in general. There is a strange irony in so many, Americans and Germans and Brits and French and whatever saying, refugees welcome, not realizing what those refugees have to go through to leave, abandoning their culture, abandoning their religion, letting their children be vulnerable to secularization in the public schools, everything, but also who they're leaving behind and what they're leaving behind. The fact of the matter is, facilitating the emigration of all Christians from the Middle East isn't an act of charity to those communities. It's really their suicide in a way. And so what I would like to bring attention to in terms of the future is the need to, just as Hungary, as a country with low birth rates, that is dealing with the problem, but obviously not to the level where it's recovered to the replacement rate. I think Middle Eastern Christians also need to have attention given to their side of that problem. And I very much hope that in time we'll see families thriving again in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Israel, in Palestine, and in Egypt. But with insecurity, with fear of persecution, having to look over your shoulder because you're afraid that your neighbor might do whatever to you, it's very difficult to justify having a big family. It's very difficult to justify taking out a loan to buy a house if it might get burned down. There are real connections between Christian persecution, between the demographics of Christians in the Middle East, and between the emigration problem. And I think that until that gets resolved, and I believe that it can be, we are looking at what could be a very slow but sad decline of Christianity in its historic homeland and in its birthplace.
What would be the solution?
I believe that organizations like Hungary Helps, which are working to provide long-term solutions to reduce the burden really, because it is a public health problem. You know, when we talk about the disease burden of smoking or the disease burden of divorce upon children, which actually, by the way, has been found in recent studies to reduce the overall lifespan of children by, I believe it's approximately 5 years, according to Dr. Fagan of Pennsylvania. I believe that building up those long-term solutions is a way that we can reduce the disease burden, so to speak, of persecution upon individuals. Women being paranoid about, being followed because maybe, I wasn't wearing my hijab and maybe he knows I'm Christian, are probably not going to feel safe and secure enough to settle down in an area and have families. And in fact, if you come to our church and you talk to some of the women there, you'll hear stories such as this. I mean, not everyone, again, I don't want to exaggerate this, but those stories are there and the sentiment is real. So I believe that we have to follow a sort of chain of effect where we restore trust between communities and make people feel safe in their own countries again. We empower them with jobs and basically opportunities rather than poaching them away to the West and saying, well, don't stay in Egypt and work there for a low salary. Come to America and be a web developer and lose your entire identity. This is a very common thing. And I believe through that, the emigration problem, the decline can be prevented, can be slowed, can be ended. And I think we can have a bright future for Christian communities in the Middle East again.
All right, as a last question, I would like to ask you if you could send some sort of message to the European Christians and maybe to the North American Christians also, what would it be? What do you think is the most important message they should hear now?
Well, I actually came here with a gift for you, Jonathan, and for your entire team. This is an icon, which I'm going to hand to you now.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. This is an icon of the 21 martyrs with Saint Matthew at the top. Saint Matthew was the one who did not have to die that day. He was kidnapped by ISIS along with the rest of them, operating ISIS as they do, operating like a gang. And they were going to let him go. He could have been released. But he saw our 20 martyrs being led to their deaths on that day. And he made a decision after he made a realization. And what he realized was this: I can go off. I can fulfill whatever plans I had of migrating to Europe or doing whatever. I can live my life and I can find a nice woman and I can be happy. But this right here in this moment is the truest truth that I can ever experience. And that is where I will follow. And I believe that if European Christians can take one message, one lesson from the 21 martyrs of Libya, it is to follow the truth follow goodness, and love God wherever he leads you.
Amen. Antonius, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me. It was a real pleasure.